Sarah Miller stared out the cabin window, watching the dust cloud trail behind Richard's Mercedes as it disappeared down the dirt road. 20 years of marriage vanished with it. The tires had kicked up a storm of dust that now settled on the overgrown path. Much like the reality of her situation was settling on her shoulders. "You'll just hold me back now," he had said. His final words before closing the car door. 6 months ago, life had been different. She'd been different. Before the accident that put her in this wheelchair, Sarah and Richard had lived in their Seattle mansion with its panoramic views of Puget Sound. They'd hosted dinner parties for tech executives and venture capitalists. They'd traveled to Europe twice a year. They'd been happy, or so she thought. Now she sat alone in her grandparents' old cabin in Pinewood Valley, Montana, a place she hadn't visited since she was a teenager. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had helped Richard build his tech empire from nothing, standing by him through the lean years, the 18-hour workdays, the failed prototypes. And now that she needed him, he was gone. The cabin creaked as a gust of wind pushed against its weathered walls. Sarah wheeled herself away from the window and surveyed what was now her home. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a small bedroom and bathroom off to one side. Dust covered most surfaces, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been replaced since the 1970s. The floral patterned couch had worn patches, and the dining table was scarred from decades of use. "Home sweet home," she muttered, her voice sounding hollow in the empty space. Richard had generously left her the cabin, which had been her inheritance anyway, and arranged for a monthly stipend to be deposited into her account. Enough to survive, not enough to thrive. Certainly not enough to hire help for the repairs the cabin desperately needed. Sarah's phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, half hoping it was Richard having a change of heart. Instead, it was a notification from her bank. The first stipend payment had arrived. $1,200. She did a quick mental calculation of what she'd need: groceries, utilities, medication, possible repairs. It would be tight. Very tight. She considered calling some of their friends. Their Seattle social circle consisted of wealthy couples who had summer homes in exotic locations and collected expensive art. But pride stopped her. She couldn't bear their pity, or worse, their awkward attempts to stay neutral in what they would inevitably view as a messy divorce. No, she would figure this out on her own. Sarah had built her career as a landscape architect, designing gardens for celebrities and tech millionaires. She had an eye for taking difficult spaces and transforming them into something beautiful. Now she needed to apply that same creativity to her own life. Rain began to patter against the roof, softly at first, then with increasing intensity. Sarah looked up, just as a drop of water fell from the ceiling, landing with a plop on the hardwood floor. Another drop followed, then another. Soon, a steady stream was forming a puddle near the kitchen area. "Perfect," she sighed, wheeling herself to the kitchen to find something to catch the water. She found an old pot in one of the cupboards and positioned it under the leak. The metallic ping of water hitting metal created a steady rhythm that only emphasized her solitude. That night, Sarah slept fitfully on the lumpy sofa, unable to access the bedroom in her wheelchair. The rain continued through the night, the leaky roof a constant reminder of all the work the cabin needed. By morning, she had made a mental list of priorities. Fix the roof, make the cabin accessible, find a way to earn more money. The rain had stopped by the time she woke, and sunlight streamed through the dusty windows. Despite everything, the natural beauty of Pinewood Valley was undeniable. Tall pines surrounded the cabin, and in the distance, mountains rose majestically against a clear blue sky. A knock at the door startled her. Sarah wasn't expecting anyone. "Hello?" called a gruff voice. "Anyone home?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "Yes, who is it?" "Jim Townsend. I live down the road. Used to check on this place for your grandparents." Sarah wheeled herself to the door and opened it to find an elderly man with weather-beaten skin and kind eyes standing on her porch. He wore worn jeans and a flannel shirt, and his white hair stuck out from under a faded baseball cap. "You must be Sarah," he said, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her wheelchair. "Your grandparents always spoke highly of you." "Yes, I'm Sarah. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Townsend." "Call me Jim. Everyone does." He gestured toward the roof. "Noticed some shingles missing when I drove by yesterday. With the rain we had, you must have leaks." Sarah nodded. "The kitchen's the worst, but there's another in the living room." Jim rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I could take a look if you'd like. Used to do some roofing back in the day." Sarah hesitated. She was used to contractors in Seattle who charged hundreds just to evaluate a problem. "I can't pay much," she admitted. Jim waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about that. Made a promise to your grandparents years ago to look after this place. Just keeping my word." That afternoon, Jim climbed onto the roof while Sarah watched anxiously from below. He identified several problems: missing shingles, rotted wood underneath, and clogged gutters. "It's fixable," he reported when he came down. "Need some materials, but I've got most of the tools we'll need." "We?" Sarah questioned. Jim smiled. "Well, I'm figuring you'll want to learn how to do some of this yourself. Independent sort, from what your grandma used to say." Sarah felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, Jim. I'd like that very much." Over the next few days, Sarah and Jim fell into a routine. He would arrive in the morning with materials from the hardware store in town, and together they would work on the roof. Jim handled the tasks that required climbing, while Sarah learned to prepare materials and even nail down shingles on the lower portions she could reach from her wheelchair when Jim helped position her. As they worked, Jim shared stories about her grandparents and the community of Pinewood Valley. She learned about the town's struggles after the regional manufacturing plant closed, leaving many families without steady income. Yet despite economic hardship, the community pulled together, supporting each other in ways Sarah had never experienced in Seattle. "Your grandma was quite the gardener," Jim mentioned one afternoon as they took a break. "Had the best vegetables in the county, won blue ribbons at the fair almost every year." Sarah's interest was piqued. "Really? I didn't know that. I remember eating fresh vegetables when I visited as a kid, but I didn't realize she was known for her garden." "Oh yeah, Martha Miller's tomatoes were legendary. Folks would trade all sorts of things just to get their hands on them." That evening after Jim left, Sarah wheeled herself around the property, examining the overgrown areas where her grandmother's garden must have been. Most was reclaimed by weeds and grass, but she could make out the faint outline of what once were beds and paths. Her mind began to work, thinking of possibilities. As a landscape architect, she had designed ornamental gardens, never focusing much on vegetables or sustainability. But she knew the principles. With her professional knowledge and her grandmother's location, could she possibly? The following day, Sarah asked Jim about the basement. "I think my grandparents used to store canning supplies and garden tools down there. Is there any way I could access it?" Jim scratched his head. "It's not wheelchair accessible, that's for sure. But we could rig something up, or I could bring things up for you to look at." They settled on the latter option. Jim descended into the musty basement and began bringing up boxes and crates. Most contained old clothes, holiday decorations, and household items, but one wooden trunk caught Sarah's attention. "That's it," she said excitedly. "That's my grandmother's garden trunk. She showed it to me once when I was about 12. Inside, they found a treasure trove, dozens of carefully labeled glass jars containing seeds, handwritten journals documenting decades of planting seasons, and even some old gardening tools that had been well maintained. Sarah opened one of the journals with reverent hands. Her grandmother's neat handwriting filled the pages, detailing soil conditions, weather patterns, successful crops, and lessons learned from failures. Tucked between pages were newspaper clippings about her award-winning produce and photographs of abundant harvests. "This is incredible," Sarah whispered. She turned to Jim with newfound determination in her eyes. I want to restart her garden." Jim raised his eyebrows. "That's a big undertaking, especially from a wheelchair." "I know," Sarah acknowledged, "but I'm a landscape architect. I can design raised beds that I can reach. I just need help building them." She looked at him hopefully. Jim's weathered face broke into a smile. "Well, I do know a thing or two about carpentry, and Mike down at the lumberyard might give us a discount if I tell him we're reviving Martha Miller's garden." For the first time since the accident, since Richard left her, Sarah felt a spark of genuine excitement. This old cabin in the middle of nowhere wasn't what she would have chosen, but maybe, just maybe, it could become something more than a place to hide away. That night, she pored over her grandmother's journals by lamplight, absorbing decades of agricultural wisdom. Outside, the Montana sky filled with stars more numerous than she'd ever seen in light-polluted Seattle. The mountains stood as silent sentinels in the distance. Sarah felt something shift inside her. The betrayal and abandonment were still there, raw wounds that would take time to heal. But alongside them grew something new, a sense of possibility. Richard had left her here to wither away, assuming she couldn't survive without him and their wealthy lifestyle. He had made a critical mistake. He had forgotten who she was before she became Mrs. Richard Taylor. He had forgotten that Sarah Miller had never backed down from a challenge. As she closed her grandmother's journal and looked out at the vast Montana night, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would not just survive here, she would thrive. Spring arrived in Pinewood Valley with a gentle persistence that reminded Sarah of hope. The snow melted, revealing patches of muddy earth that gradually turned green with new growth. It had been 3 months since Richard left her at the cabin. 3 months of adjusting to rural life and her new reality. With Jim's help, Sarah had managed to make the cabin livable. They had fixed the leaky roof, installed a wheelchair ramp at the front door, and rearranged the furniture to create wider pathways for her chair. The bedroom was now accessible, though getting into bed remained a daily challenge. Each small victory reinforced Sarah's determination to make this work. On a mild April morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table reviewing her grandmother's garden journals. She had spent weeks organizing the information, creating a planting schedule based on her grandmother's notes and her own professional knowledge. Outside, Jim was helping construct the raised garden beds they had designed together. The sound of hammering paused, and Jim appeared at the door, wiping sweat from his brow. "You might want to come see this," he said. Sarah wheeled herself outside to where 6 wooden beds now stood in neat rows. Each was 36 inches high, perfect for her to reach from her wheelchair, and filled with rich, dark soil Jim had delivered from his own compost pile. "They're perfect," Sarah said, a lump forming in her throat. These simple wooden structures represented so much more than just a garden project. They were her first step toward independence. "Mike from the lumberyard wants to stop by later," Jim mentioned. "Says he's curious about these wheelchair-friendly beds. His mother's been having trouble tending her flowers since her hip replacement." Sarah nodded. "He's welcome anytime. Maybe we can show him how they work." That afternoon, Mike Russell from the lumberyard arrived in his pickup truck. He was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe in his late 30s, with kind eyes and strong hands that spoke of years of physical labor. "These are impressive," he said, examining the beds. "Simple design, but smart." He ran his hand along the smooth edge. "My mom would love something like this. She's been gardening her whole life, and it nearly broke her heart when she couldn't get down on her knees anymore after her surgery." "I could share the designs," Sarah offered. "They're not complicated." Mike looked thoughtful. "Actually, I was thinking, if you wouldn't mind, maybe we could work out a trade. I could build some of these for my mom and maybe a few extra to sell at the lumberyard, and in exchange, I could help with any other construction you need around here. Jim mentioned you were thinking about fixing up the old shed." Sarah considered the offer. The shed behind the cabin was in worse shape than the cabin itself, but it could provide valuable storage space if repaired. "That sounds fair," she agreed. As Mike left with copies of Sarah's designs, Jim gave her a knowing look. "Mike's a good man," he said. "Lost his wife to cancer 3 years ago. Raises his daughter on his own." Sarah chose to ignore Jim's unsubtle hint. Romance was the furthest thing from her mind. Her focus needed to be on creating stability for herself. The next morning, Sarah began planting. She had sorted through her grandmother's seed collection, selecting varieties that her journals indicated grew well in this soil and climate. She worked methodically, her hands remembering the motions from years of gardening experience, though now she performed them from her chair instead of kneeling. As she placed the seeds in the soil, Sarah thought about Richard. By now, he had likely moved on completely, perhaps even dating someone new. Someone who could stand beside him at parties, someone without complications, as he had called her wheelchair. The thought still stung, but not as sharply as before. Days turned into weeks as Sarah fell into a new routine. Mornings were spent tending the garden, afternoons often involved some project around the cabin with Jim's help, and evenings were for studying her grandmother's journals and researching modern organic gardening techniques on her laptop. The first seedlings emerged in mid-May, tiny green shoots reaching toward the sun. Sarah felt a disproportionate joy at these small signs of life. Each morning, she eagerly wheeled herself out to check their progress, taking photographs to document their growth. One Tuesday morning, a woman's voice called out from the front of the cabin. "Hello? Anyone home?" Sarah wheeled herself around to find a middle-aged woman with graying red hair standing by the garden beds, examining the plants with an expert eye. "I'm Ellie Thompson," the woman introduced herself. "I run the farmer's market in town. Jim mentioned you were reviving your grandmother's garden, and I had to come see for myself. Martha Miller's vegetables were legendary around these parts." Sarah invited Ellie in for coffee, and they talked gardening for over an hour. Sarah learned that the Pinewood Valley Farmers Market had been struggling in recent years, with fewer local producers participating as people moved away for better opportunities. "We could use some quality produce," Ellie said. "Once you have a harvest, you should consider taking a booth at the market." Martha always drew a crowd. The suggestion took Sarah by surprise. She had been thinking of the garden primarily as a way to feed herself and regain some control over her life. The idea of selling her produce hadn't occurred to her. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "It's a small garden. I'm not sure I'll have enough to sell." Ellie smiled. "Start small. Even a few baskets of specialty greens or heirloom tomatoes would be welcome. Think about it." After Ellie left, Sarah wheeled herself out to look at her garden with new eyes. Could this become more than just a personal project? Could it actually help support her financially? June brought both challenges and rewards. A late frost threatened the young plants, forcing Sarah to cover them with old sheets and blankets. A family of rabbits discovered the garden, requiring Mike to install fencing around the beds. But despite these setbacks, the plants thrived. By late June, Sarah was harvesting lettuce, spinach, and radishes for her own meals. The first time she made a salad entirely from vegetables she had grown herself, Sarah took a picture and almost sent it to Richard before stopping herself. He wouldn't care. Instead, she sent it to Jim with a thank you message for all his help. His reply was simple. "Martha would be proud." Those 4 words meant more to Sarah than any praise from Richard ever had. July brought her first trip to the farmer's market. Mike offered to drive her and her modest harvest: 3 baskets of mixed greens, a basket of radishes, and some early summer squash. Sarah had created simple labels using her grandmother's name: Miller Family Heirloom Vegetables. Setting up at the market was challenging. The uneven ground made navigating in her wheelchair difficult, and arranging the display from a seated position took creative problem-solving. But Ellie had placed her booth near the entrance, and the Miller name attracted attention from older community members who remembered her grandmother. "These are Martha's greens, all right," declared an elderly woman, holding up a bunch of lettuce. "I'd recognize that red speckled leaf anywhere." She never would share her seed secrets. By noon, Sarah had sold everything she brought. The money wasn't much, just under $60, but the sense of accomplishment was enormous. For the first time since the accident, She had earned income through her own efforts. As Mike helped load her empty baskets back into his truck, he seemed as pleased as she was. "My daughter Hannah wants to meet you," he said. "She's 12 and getting interested in growing things. Would you mind if she came by sometime to see your garden?" "I'd like that," Sarah replied, genuinely meaning it. The following week, Mike brought Hannah to the cabin. She was a quiet girl with her father's kind eyes and a serious expression that softened when she saw the garden. "Dad said you can garden from a wheelchair," she said with 12-year-old directness. "My grandma wants to keep gardening, but says she's too old to kneel anymore." Sarah showed Hannah how the raised beds were designed, explaining how the height and width made them accessible. "Would you like to help me harvest some tomatoes?" she offered. Hannah proved to be a natural gardener, quickly learning how to tell which tomatoes were ready to pick and handling the plants with gentle care. As they worked, Sarah taught her about companion planting and natural pest control, knowledge gleaned from both her professional experience and her grandmother's journals. "You know a lot," Hannah observed. "I used to design gardens for rich people in Seattle," Sarah explained. "Big, fancy gardens that looked nice but weren't always practical. This is different. This garden needs to produce food, not just look pretty." Hannah considered this. "I like this kind better," she decided. "You can eat tomatoes, you can't eat fancy flowers." Sarah laughed, appreciating the girl's straightforward logic. "That's very true." As the summer progressed, Sarah's garden flourished beyond her expectations. The weekly trips to the farmer's market became a highlight, with her produce consistently selling out. Regular customers began to seek out her booth, specifically requesting her heirloom varieties that offered flavors missing from supermarket vegetables. The income from the market wasn't substantial, but combined with Richard's stipend, it allowed Sarah to build a small savings account. More importantly, it connected her to the community in ways she hadn't anticipated. People recognized her, not as the abandoned wife in a wheelchair, but as Martha Miller's granddaughter who grew exceptional vegetables. One evening in late August, Sarah sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. Her phone rang, Richard's ringtone. She stared at the screen, her heart suddenly racing. It was the first time he had called since leaving her here. For a moment, Sarah considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out. "Hello, Richard," she answered, working to keep her voice neutral. "Sarah." His voice sounded strained. "How are you?" "I'm managing. Why are you calling?" There was a pause before he replied. There's a problem with the company. Some financial journalists have been asking questions about my personal life, about us, about why you're living in Montana while I'm in Seattle." So that was it. Not concern for her welfare, but concern for his reputation. "What do you want from me, Richard?" Sarah asked directly. "They're painting me as the villain who abandoned his disabled wife. It's affecting investor confidence." Sarah felt a surprising calm settle over her. 6 months ago, this call would have devastated her, either with renewed hope or fresh pain. Now it simply confirmed what she already knew about the man she had married. "That's unfortunate," she said, "but I don't see how I can help you." "If you could just tell them that the separation was mutual, that you wanted to live in Montana to connect with your family roots or something." "No." Sarah's voice was firm. "I won't lie for you, Richard. You left me here with almost nothing because you didn't want a wife in a wheelchair. That's the truth." The line went silent for a moment. "I see," he finally said. "I thought you might be more reasonable, considering I'm still supporting you financially." Sarah laughed without humor. "The monthly stipend that barely covers my basic needs? That support?" "I could reduce it," he threatened. Looking out at her thriving garden and thinking of her growing connections in Pinewood Valley, Sarah realized something important. She was no longer the same desperate woman he had left behind. "Do what you think is right, Richard," she said calmly. "I'll do the same." She ended the call before he could respond, then sat in the growing darkness, processing what had just happened. Instead of anxiety or anger, she felt something unexpected: freedom. Whether Richard reduced her stipend or not, Sarah knew she would find a way forward. Her life was here now, among the mountains and gardens of Pinewood Valley. It wasn't the life she had planned, but increasingly, it was a life she could embrace. As the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would ask Mike about expanding the garden for next season. It was time to think bigger. The Montana winter arrived with a fierce determination that matched Sarah's own. Snow blanketed Pinewood Valley, transforming the landscape into a pristine white canvas. The garden beds lay dormant under protective coverings, waiting for spring's return. Sarah had spent the fall preparing for winter, preserving her harvest through canning and freezing techniques learned from her grandmother's journals. Glass jars filled with tomatoes, pickles and jams lined the shelves Jim had installed in the kitchen. The basement now housed bags of potatoes and winter squash, stored properly to last through the cold months. "You've got enough to feed an army," Mike commented one December afternoon as he helped Sarah insulate the cabin's windows against the cold. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, carefully labeling seed packets Sarah had collected from her plants. "Or at least enough to feed myself and share with friends," Sarah replied. The word friends came naturally now. In the 8 months since Richard left her, Sarah had created a small but solid support network in Pinewood Valley. Mike had become a regular presence, stopping by several times a week to help with cabin improvements or simply to share a cup of coffee. Hannah often accompanied him, especially on weekends, eager to learn more about gardening and to tell Sarah about school. The relationship with Mike had developed gradually into something Sarah hadn't expected, a comfortable friendship with undercurrents she wasn't quite ready to examine. For now, friendship was enough. As Christmas approached, Sarah faced her first holiday season alone. Richard had always handled their social calendar during the holidays, filling December with corporate parties and gatherings with their wealthy friends. This year, there would be no elegant parties or expensive gifts. Sarah was surprised to find she didn't miss the glittering events as much as she expected. Instead, she accepted Ellie's invitation to the community Christmas potluck at the town hall, bringing jars of her homemade apple butter as gifts. The hall was decorated with simple handmade ornaments and strings of colored lights. Children ran between tables, while adults chatted over plates of home-cooked food. Sarah's apple butter was a hit, particularly when paired with Jim's wife Betty's fresh-baked bread. "You should consider selling these preserves at the winter market," Ellie suggested, scraping the last bit of apple butter from a sample jar. "We run it once a month in the town hall during winter, smaller than the summer market, but people still come looking for local goods." Sarah considered the idea. Her summer earnings from the market had been modest but encouraging. "I didn't realize there was a winter market," she said. "First Saturday of each month, January through April," Ellie explained. "We could use some quality products. Most of what we get is crafts and the occasional root vegetables." The winter market proved to be another turning point. Sarah's preserves, labeled as Miller Family Kitchen products, sold out within 2 hours of the January market opening. By February, she had developed a small but loyal customer base who specifically sought out her goods. One customer, a woman in her 60s named Carol, lingered at Sarah's booth after purchasing several jars. "These raised beds Mike's been selling at the lumberyard," she said. "I hear they're your design." Sarah nodded. "We worked on them together, but yes, the original design was mine." "My arthritis makes gardening nearly impossible these days," Carol explained. "But Mike built me one of your beds, and I managed my first tomato crop in years last summer." Her eyes grew moist. "You have no idea what that meant to me, to grow something again." The conversation stayed with Sarah for days afterward. She began to realize that her accessibility solutions might help others beyond herself. With Mike's assistance, she refined the raised bed design, making it even more user-friendly for people with various physical limitations. By March, Sarah had sketched plans for an expanded garden system that would include vertical growing elements for people who couldn't reach across standard raised beds. Mike was enthusiastic about the ideas, offering suggestions based on his carpentry expertise. "We could build a prototype on your property," he suggested one evening as they reviewed her drawings. Hannah had fallen asleep on the sofa after helping Sarah organize seed packets for the upcoming planting season. "I've been thinking about that," Sarah said. "The property next door has been abandoned for years, according to Jim. If I could somehow acquire it, there would be enough space to create a demonstration garden." Mike looked thoughtful. "Old man Peterson's place?" "It's been empty since he moved to his daughter's in Idaho. Must be 5 years now. County might be willing to sell it for back taxes." The idea took root, growing alongside the seedlings Sarah started indoors as winter grudgingly gave way to spring. She researched property acquisition, surprised to discover the adjacent lot might be available for less than $10,000 in back taxes and fees. Sarah examined her finances carefully. Richard's stipend had continued unchanged despite his threats, perhaps because he feared what she might say to journalists if provoked. Combined with her market earnings and careful budgeting, she had managed to save almost $8,000. Not quite enough, but close. An unexpected opportunity arose in April when Sarah received an email about a small business grant program sponsored by the state agricultural department. The program aimed to promote innovative farming practices in rural communities, with grants ranging from $5,000 to $20,000. "You should apply," Jim insisted when Sarah mentioned it. "Your accessible gardening systems are exactly the kind of innovation they're looking for." With Jim and Ellie's encouragement, Sarah completed the lengthy application, detailing her vision for what she now called Accessible Gardens, a demonstration site where people with physical limitations could learn adaptive gardening techniques. The application required a business plan, forcing Sarah to think beyond her immediate needs to the potential growth of her idea. Mike helped her create a budget for materials, while Ellie offered insights about market demand based on her years running the farmers market. "Even if I don't get the grant, this process has been valuable," Sarah told Mike as they submitted the final application. "It's made me think about the future in a way I haven't since before the accident." Spring brought renewed energy to Pinewood Valley and to Sarah's projects. Her garden expanded from 6 raised beds to 10, with Mike building the new beds in exchange for Sarah teaching Hannah about heirloom vegetables and seed saving. The community had begun to take notice of Sarah's success. Several elderly residents commissioned Mike to build raised beds for their properties, often stopping by Sarah's cabin to consult about plant selection and accessibility features. In late May, Sarah received a call from the state agricultural department. Her grant application had made it to the final round, and a representative would be visiting to evaluate her project firsthand. "This is a big deal," Ellie exclaimed when Sarah shared the news at the farmers market. "They only do site visits for the top applications." The day before the scheduled visit, disaster struck. A severe spring storm moved through the valley, bringing hail and strong winds that damaged crops throughout the region. Sarah watched helplessly from her window as hailstones pelted her garden, shredding leaves and breaking tender stems. When the storm finally passed, Sarah wheeled herself outside to assess the damage. The sight was heartbreaking. Most of her plants lay flattened, their leaves torn and stems broken. Months of work, destroyed in 20 minutes of violent weather. Sarah felt tears well up as she surveyed the destruction. The grant representative would arrive tomorrow to find a ruined garden instead of the thriving demonstration project she had described in her application. Before she could fully process the loss, trucks began to arrive. Jim's pickup came first, followed by Mike's, then others, vehicles belonging to farmers and gardeners from throughout Pinewood Valley. "We heard about the damage on the community radio," Mike explained as he unloaded trays of seedlings from his truck. "Everyone's pitching in." Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, community members worked alongside Sarah, clearing debris and replanting damaged areas. Some brought spare seedlings from their own gardens. Others helped repair the raised beds where hail had splintered the wood. Hannah organized a team of children to pick up hailstones and debris from the pathways, making the garden accessible for Sarah's wheelchair again. Ellie arrived with sandwiches and coffee for the workers, while Jim's wife Betty set up a first aid station for those who had scratches from the cleanup. "Why are you all doing this?" Sarah asked Mike as the sun began to set and the work continued under portable lights. "Because that's what we do here," he replied simply. "When Martha Miller was alive, she helped plenty of folks through hard times with food from her garden. People remember that. Besides," he added with a gentle smile, "you're one of us now." By midnight, the garden had been restored as much as possible. It wasn't perfect. Some crops were lost completely. But it was presentable again, showing both the damage from the storm and the community's determination to overcome it. The next morning, Sarah met with the grant representative, a practical woman named Margaret, who had grown up on a farm and understood the realities of agricultural setbacks. "Honestly," Margaret said after touring the garden and discussing Sarah's plans, "I'm more impressed by what I'm seeing today than I would have been by a perfect garden. This shows resilience and community support, both essential for any agricultural venture." She took particular interest in the raised bed designs and Sarah's plans for the adjacent property. "The accessible aspect is what caught our committee's attention," she explained. "There's significant demand for adaptive agricultural techniques, especially in rural areas with aging populations." 2 weeks later, Sarah received the news. Accessible Gardens had been awarded a $15,000 grant to purchase the adjacent property and develop it into a demonstration site for adaptive gardening techniques. The grant money, combined with Sarah's savings, allowed her to acquire Old Man Peterson's property by mid-July. The land needed extensive clearing. Years of neglect had allowed weeds and brush to overrun what had once been a small orchard, but Sarah saw potential where others might have seen only work. Mike brought in his construction equipment on weekends, clearing brush and leveling ground for the new garden beds. Jim helped Sarah inventory the fruit trees, identifying which could be saved and which were too diseased to recover. Hannah and her friends created walking paths using wood chips donated by the lumberyard. By August, the expanded Accessible Gardens site had begun to take shape. The original garden continued to produce vegetables for the farmers' market, while the new section featured demonstration areas with various adaptive gardening techniques. Sarah designed a section specifically for wheelchair users, another for people who could stand but not bend easily, and a third for those with limited upper body strength. Each area showcased different solutions to common gardening challenges. Word about the project spread beyond Pinewood Valley. A regional newspaper ran a feature on innovative rural businesses, including a paragraph about accessible gardens. This led to an inquiry from an agricultural journalist who wanted to write a more in-depth piece. "They want to send someone next month," Sarah told Mike one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset. "A writer and photographer from Modern Farming magazine." Mike nodded approvingly. "That's great exposure. Could bring in business from all over the state." Sarah looked out at what they had created, not just the physical gardens, but the sense of purpose that had grown alongside the plants. "It's strange," she said. "When Richard left me here, I thought my life was over. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Mike was quiet for a moment before responding. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you stayed." There was a weight to his words that made Sarah turn to look at him. Over the past year, their friendship had deepened through shared work and challenges. She had come to value his steadiness, his quiet competence, his genuine kindness toward his daughter and others. "I'm glad I stayed too," she replied softly. As summer transitioned into fall, Sarah received notification that the Modern Farming article would be published in their October issue. The journalist had been impressed by both the technical innovations and the personal story behind Accessible Gardens. "They're featuring us in their agricultural innovations section," Sarah told Jim and Betty over dinner at their house. "They especially liked the vertical growing systems Mike designed for people who can't reach across beds." "Well, of course they did," Betty said proudly. "Between your gardening knowledge and Mike's building skills, you two make quite a team." September brought the harvest season, busier than ever with the expanded garden. Sarah hired 2 high school students to help part-time, teaching them about organic growing methods and adaptive techniques. The farmers' market booth now required both Sarah and Hannah to manage the increased inventory. One crisp October morning, Mike arrived at the cabin holding a magazine. "It's out," he said, handing Sarah the latest issue of Modern Farming. Page 38. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened to the article. There, spread across 4 glossy pages, was the story of Accessible Gardens, complete with professional photographs of the gardens and quotes from Sarah about adaptive gardening techniques. The writer had captured the essence of the project beautifully, describing how Sarah had transformed personal adversity into an innovative business that served people with physical limitations. The article included testimonials from community members who had benefited from the raised bed designs and techniques. What the article didn't mention, what Sarah hadn't shared with the journalist, was Richard's abandonment. She had chosen to focus on the future rather than the past, on what she had built rather than what she had lost. As Sarah read the article aloud to Mike, she felt a sense of completion. The journey from abandoned wife to successful business owner had been challenging, often painful, but ultimately transformative. What she didn't know was that 300 miles away in Seattle, the same magazine sat on Richard Taylor's desk, open to page 38, his coffee growing cold as he stared at the photographs of the woman he had left behind. A woman who had not only survived without him, but had created something meaningful and important. A woman who no longer needed him at all. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in early spring, nearly 3 years after Richard had driven away from the cabin. Sarah almost missed it, automatically sorting the cream-colored envelope into her growing stack of business mail. Accessible Gardens now received regular correspondence from gardeners across the country, seeking advice or ordering specialized gardening tools. It wasn't until that evening, as she worked through the day's mail at her kitchen table, that Sarah noticed the embossed logo of the Montana Business Innovation Conference. Inside was a formal invitation requesting her participation as a keynote speaker at their annual event in Helena. "They want me to talk about adaptive agricultural technology," she told Mike over the phone. "Apparently, someone from the state agricultural department recommended me." "You should do it," Mike said without hesitation. "What you've created deserves recognition." Sarah had grown more comfortable with public speaking over the past year. The Modern Farming article had led to requests for workshops and presentations at garden clubs and small agricultural gatherings. But a keynote address at a statewide business conference was different. Larger, more formal, more visible. "I'd need to prepare a proper presentation," she said, "with slides and everything." "Hannah's good with that computer stuff," Mike offered. "She could help you put something together." The conference was scheduled for June, giving Sarah 2 months to prepare. Between managing the spring planting and running the growing business, she carved out time each evening to work on her presentation. Hannah, now 14 and surprisingly adept with presentation software, helped create professional-looking slides featuring photographs of the gardens and diagrams of the accessible designs. As the conference date approached, Sarah found herself thinking about Richard. He ran in business circles. Would he possibly hear about her presentation? The thought no longer filled her with anxiety, as it once might have. Her life had moved forward in ways she never could have imagined when he left her at the cabin. Accessible Gardens now employed 4 part-time workers from the community. The demonstration gardens had expanded to include a teaching area where Sarah held weekly classes on adaptive gardening techniques. The online store, managed by Ellie, who had retired from running the farmers market, shipped specialized gardening tools and raised bed kits across the country. Sarah's relationship with Mike had deepened as well. What began as a practical partnership had grown into something more meaningful. They had been taking things slowly, both cautious after past hurts, but the connection between them was undeniable. The night before leaving for the conference, Sarah sat with Mike on her porch, now expanded and fully accessible thanks to his carpentry skills. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "There will be successful business people there, executives with college degrees and years of experience." Mike took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. And none of them built what you built from nothing, Sarah. None of them turned adversity into a business that helps hundreds of people. Sarah squeezed his hand. Thank you for believing in me. Always have, he replied simply. The Montana Business Innovation Conference was held at a large hotel in Helena. The organizers had been attentive to Sarah's accessibility needs, ensuring her hotel room and all event spaces were wheelchair-friendly. Her presentation was scheduled for the second day as part of the Social Innovation track. Sarah spent the first day attending other sessions, taking notes on presentation styles, and connecting with fellow entrepreneurs. Several people recognized her from the magazine article, approaching her with questions about adaptive gardening or sharing stories of relatives who might benefit from her designs. That evening, she reviewed her presentation one final time in her hotel room, making small adjustments based on what she had observed during the day's sessions. As she practiced her opening lines, Sarah realized how far she had come from the devastated woman Richard had abandoned. She had not only survived, she had built something meaningful. The next morning, Sarah arrived early at the presentation room to test the technology and familiarize herself with the space. The room gradually filled with attendees, more than she had expected for what she considered a niche topic. At precisely 10 a.m., the moderator introduced her. Our next speaker has revolutionized adaptive gardening techniques for people with mobility challenges. Please welcome the founder of Accessible Gardens, Sarah Miller. As Sarah wheeled herself onto the stage, she surveyed the audience and froze. In the back row, partially obscured by other attendees but unmistakable, sat Richard. Their eyes met briefly before Sarah pulled her gaze away, focusing instead on the friendly face of the moderator. Taking a deep breath, she began her presentation as planned, sharing the story of Accessible Gardens' evolution from personal necessity to thriving business. She described the technical challenges of creating truly accessible garden systems and how community collaboration had been essential to the project's success. As she spoke, Sarah felt her initial shock at Richard's presence fade, replaced by a calm confidence. This was her story now, not their story. Richard was just another person in the audience. Adaptive design isn't about working around limitations, she concluded. It's about creating new possibilities. Thank you. The applause was enthusiastic, with several attendees rising to their feet. Sarah fielded questions for 15 minutes, discussing everything from technical specifications to business models. Richard remained silent, watching from the back row. After the session ended, attendees gathered around Sarah, exchanging business cards and continuing the conversation. She noticed Richard hanging back, waiting until the crowd thinned before approaching her. He looked older somehow, though it had been just 3 years. His designer suit couldn't hide the slight slump in his shoulders or the new lines around his eyes. "Your presentation was impressive," he said, his voice carrying a tension Sarah recognized from difficult business negotiations. "I had no idea you'd built all this." "Why are you here, Richard?" Sarah asked directly. "I'm speaking tomorrow on tech investment trends," he replied. "I saw your name in the program and—" He trailed off, then added, "I was curious." A conference organizer approached them. "Ms. Miller, the lunch panel is about to begin. You're seated at the speaker's table." "I'll be right there," Sarah told her, then turned back to Richard. "I need to go." "Could we talk later?" he asked quickly. "Perhaps dinner. My treat, of course." Sarah considered refusing, but curiosity won out. "Fine. The hotel restaurant at 7. Throughout the afternoon sessions, Sarah found her thoughts drifting to the upcoming dinner. What could Richard possibly want? Their divorce had been finalized over a year ago, the minimal settlement hardly worth fighting over given his wealth. She called Mike from her hotel room before heading down to the restaurant. "Richard is here at the conference," she explained. "We're having dinner." Mike was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay with that?" "I think so," Sarah replied. "I'm curious what he wants. And maybe—" She hesitated. "Maybe there's some closure to be found." "Just remember who you are now," Mike said gently. "Not who you were when he left." The hotel restaurant was elegant without being pretentious. Richard was already seated when Sarah arrived, rising as the host showed her to the table. They exchanged awkward pleasantries as they studied their menus. Richard ordered an expensive bottle of wine, then seemed to remember and added, "Unless you'd prefer something else?" "Water is fine," Sarah said. She no longer felt the need to pretend around him. After their orders were placed, Richard leaned forward. "Your business is remarkable, Sarah, truly. The accessibility innovations, the community engagement. It's impressive." "Thank you," Sarah said, waiting for whatever would come next. Richard sipped his wine. "I've been following your progress, actually, since the Modern Farming article." "You saw that?" He nodded. "One of our VPs brought it to my attention. He has a mother with mobility issues." Richard paused. "The company hasn't been doing well, Sarah. The last 2 product launches underperformed, and we've lost market share to competitors." "I'm sorry to hear that," Sarah said, meaning it, despite everything. Richard had built that company from nothing, just as she had built Accessible Gardens. "The board is concerned about leadership," he continued. "There have been questions about my judgment, especially after—" He looked down at his glass. "After some personal decisions became public." Sarah realized what he was saying. "You mean leaving me?" Richard nodded, not meeting her eyes. "A financial blog ran a story about it last year. Called it a pattern of abandonment, suggested it reflected on my business ethics." He looked up finally. They weren't wrong. Their food arrived, giving Sarah a moment to process his words. Was this an apology? An explanation? She wasn't sure. "What do you want from me, Richard?" she asked after the server left. "I don't know," he admitted. "When I saw your name in the conference program, I thought maybe—" He shook his head. "The truth is, I've made a mess of things, Sarah. The company is struggling. My relationship with Melissa ended badly. I look at what you've built from nothing, and I realize what a terrible mistake I made." There it was. What part of her had once desperately wanted to hear? Richard regretted leaving her, but the words didn't bring the satisfaction she might have expected. Instead, she felt a strange sadness for the man across from her, who seemed so diminished from the confident entrepreneur she had married. "We can't go back, Richard," she said gently. "I know that," he replied quickly. "I don't expect— I just wanted to see you. To apologize, I guess." Sarah studied him. "Are you apologizing because you genuinely regret hurting me? Or because your decision had negative consequences for you?" Richard looked startled, then thoughtful. "Both, probably," he admitted. "I'd like to think I've gained some self-awareness, but I can't deny the practical problems that resulted." He set down his fork. "I treated you terribly, Sarah. I was selfish and shallow and cruel. There's no justification for that." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "Your life seems good now," Richard finally said. "The business, the community you mentioned in your talk." Sarah nodded. "It is good. Different than I expected, but good." "You're seeing someone? That carpenter you mentioned?" "Mike," Sarah confirmed. "Yes, we're together." Richard nodded, looking genuinely pleased despite the circumstances. "I'm glad. You deserve happiness, Sarah." As they finished their meal, the conversation shifted to safer topics: mutual acquaintances from Seattle, changes in the tech industry, memories from the early days of Richard's company when Sarah had believed in his vision enough to work alongside him for nothing but the promise of future success. When the check came, Richard insisted on paying. "It's the least I can do," he said. Outside the restaurant, they paused, the moment of parting awkward after the strange intimacy of dinner. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked. "With the company, I mean." Richard shrugged. "Keep fighting, I suppose. Try to rebuild investor confidence, develop a new product line." He smiled ruefully. "What else can I do? It's my life's work." I understand that feeling now, Sarah said. Richard nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. I watched you during your presentation today. You seemed so confident, so purposeful. I remember when you used to look at me that way, back when we were building the company together. We were good partners once, Sarah acknowledged. Yes, we were. Richard looked at her directly. I should never have left you, Sarah. Not because of what I lost, but because of who you are. You didn't deserve that. The simple acknowledgement, so long in coming, brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. Thank you for saying that. Richard reached out as if to embrace her, then caught himself, offering his hand instead. I wish you every success, Sarah Miller. You've earned it. Sarah took his hand. You too, Richard. I hope you find your way forward. As she watched him walk toward the elevator, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for what had been lost, gratitude for where she had landed, and finally, a sense of genuine closure. Back in her hotel room, Sarah called Mike. How did it go? He asked. It was healing, actually, she replied. He's struggling, both personally and professionally. I think he genuinely regrets leaving me. Does that change anything for you? Mike's question was straightforward, without jealousy or insecurity. No, Sarah said with certainty. That chapter of my life is closed, but I'm glad we talked. I think I needed to see him as just a flawed person, not the man who destroyed my life. Because he didn't destroy your life, Mike said. He just sent it in a different direction. Sarah smiled at the simple truth of that statement. Exactly. 2 days later, Sarah returned to Pinewood Valley, to the gardens that had saved her and the community that had embraced her. Mike and Hannah met her at the bus station, Hannah chattering excitedly about developments at the gardens during Sarah's absence. As they drove back to the cabin, now expanded and renovated into a comfortable home, Sarah looked out at the Montana landscape she had come to love. The mountains stood unchanged against the sky, the forests were lush with spring growth, and ahead lay the gardens where Sarah had rebuilt her life. Richard had left her here to suffer, but instead she had found purpose. He had abandoned her in what he thought was poverty, but she had discovered a richness of community and meaning that no money could buy. Sarah reached for Mike's hand as they turned onto the driveway, leading to accessible gardens. The demonstration plots were thriving, raised beds bursting with young plants tended by the employees Sarah now considered friends. The teaching pavilion Mike had built last summer stood ready for the weekend's adaptive gardening workshop, which was fully booked with participants from 3 states. This was her life now, not a consolation prize or a backup plan, but a purpose-filled journey she had created from the broken pieces Richard had left behind. As Mike parked the truck, Sarah looked at the sign over the entrance. Accessible Gardens, Growing Possibilities. The words had been Sarah's idea, but Mike had crafted the sign with his own hands, a perfect collaboration that symbolized all they had built together. Sarah Miller had not just survived abandonment, she had transformed it into triumph. And that, she realized as she wheeled herself toward the gardens with Mike and Hannah beside her, was the greatest victory of all.